The other thing that the Incas are kind of famous for, they did not invent, but they certainly expanded more than anybody else in the Americas. They expanded agriculture, and the way they did it in a very topographically difficult and complex region, which means very steep. They made these things. They made terraces, which they call in Peru andenes, and these are specialized platforms that they carved out of the mountains, and they set up in such a way that if you tried to grow things right up here, the rains would wash it away, that kind of thing. And these were planters basically, and they were engineered in such a fashion that you'd have gravel down here for good drainage, some sand, and then this could be 2,000 feet up on the side of a very steep mountain. They would take fertile soil from down the valley and haul it all the way up there and fill them in, just like you would a planter bed. And they expanded as a consequence. The amount, nobody's ever cultivated as much land since the Incas in South America. You know, even today, they don't cultivate as much land. This allowed them to really maximize the agricultural productivity. And these terraces are still on. This is on the site of Machu Picchu. It looks very colorful, but these are all the same kind of engineered terraces. And back in the day, they would have grown sacred corn and different kinds of things for the local population here, and also for sacrifices. So you see these everywhere in the Andes. Another survival technique that the Incas practiced, and they got it from previous cultures that live in the Andes, is that what's called by anthropologists a vertical archipelago, which means that as you climb in elevation, the temperature changes. As the temperature changes, the flora and fauna change. And here's like just some examples of, you know, down here at the Amazon rain jungle. Here we're at Lake Titicaca, it's like 12,000 feet, and so on all the way up to the glaciated areas. But you can grow different crops at different levels. And if you have access to those different levels, then you can have a blizzard or something terrible happen at one of these elevations, but you have things planted that would be safe. So here's just some of the examples of crops that can be grown at different elevations going up the side of the Andes. And the Incas and the pre-Incas took advantage of this. And so they might have a village down in some lowland valley, but they would have trails and they would be harvesting and cultivating all these different crops all the way up to snow line. You know, there's nothing to, you know, to walk up 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, you know, feet elevation and go harvest stuff and bring it back. So they were masters at cultivating this really extreme environment. If you haven't been to Peru, this is a town called Moray, which is outside of Cusco, near the Sacred Valley. And archaeologists believe that this was an agricultural experimental station. It looks like a UFO landing site, but it's an agricultural experimental station. And the range in temperatures in this spot from down here to up here, it could range 30 to 50 degrees on a typical day. So they would practice cultivating different cultivars from across the empire. They would experiment and see, well, if we're growing, you know, cotton grows at a certain elevation down there, can we grow it at different elevations up here? And they would experiment. And they've done archaeological tests, and sure enough, they were doing all this experimentation here. So and this is the scale of this place. These are people right here. And it's not the only one. There's a whole bunch of these scattered around. So they not only experimented, as did pre-Inca people, but they experimented in a very rigorous way in expanding their knowledge of horticulture. And also they were doing the same thing with llamas and alpacas. There's never been such fine fleece on an alpaca since the days of the Incas, because they had done specialized breeding. And one of the things that's pretty amazing about them, they sometimes call the Incas socialists, but they paid a lot of attention for sustainability and keeping their populations safe, because for one reason, just very pragmatically, peasants were the powerhouse of the empire. So they had surpluses of food that were used for taxes, and they would put them in these big storehouses. And here's some storehouses outside of, in the Sacred Valley area, which is on the way to Machu Picchu. It's a town called Ollantaytambo. But they had these staggered throughout the empire. And this is up on the mountainside, so there's good winds there, and they'd store grains and all kinds of stuff. In fact, when the first Spanish conquistadors came down there, they kept chronicles, and they marveled at seeing these storage places. They said they were filled to the brim with sandals and clothing and food, And whenever something happened, a drought happened or some kind of calamity happened in the area, they were the local population could draw upon these storehouses, which were provided by the state. And so if they used them up, then they were replenished from elsewhere in the empire. So they had a whole system of like food reserves and clothing reserves and weapons reserves and that kind of thing administered throughout the empire.